This is Mac Haddo, Senior Fellow on Public Policy with the American Kratom Association, and I'm doing this video to replace the Zoom call that we attempted to do this evening to describe the situation in Nevada with the Board of Pharmacy's action to proceed with and start the process of scheduling of Kratom's two alkaloids, metrogenine and 7-hydroxymetrogenine. Unfortunately, while we were recording this Zoom call, we got hacked by some of these infamous porn group, and they ruined that meeting, and we're deeply apologetic for that. We will implement the procedures that are necessary in the future to try to avoid that circumstance. But so that we can get the information out, there were two issues that we covered. The first is the situation in Nevada. It is true that the Board of Pharmacy had a work session this past week on the recommendation that had been initiated by the staff at the Board of Pharmacy that was a result of conversations that took place that occur on a regular quarterly basis with law enforcement officials around the state and also with the coroners. Now, typically, this information looks at the emerging kinds of substances that are creating problems on the streets that need to have action taken by the Board of Pharmacy. In this case, it was a discussion about Kratom that was initiated largely by and supported by the law enforcement, largely by the coroners. And it was the characterization of the executive secretary of the Board of Pharmacy that the coroners had identified a number of deaths that were associated with Kratom. And upon questioning, he acknowledged that there was actually only one death that had been attributed to Kratom alone. They did not ask, the board did not ask for, nor did they receive the specific autopsy data or the tox screen of the individual that had been cited, the decedent, that was Kratom only. We have examined this very kind of issue in the past. First, when the FDA published their claim that there were 44 deaths associated with Kratom, we issued a Freedom of Information Act request and received the data on those deaths. And we had an independent consultant, Jane Babin, and I'm sure most of you have read this report. It showed that in each of those cases that the deaths were actually attributed to polydrug use or the consumption of an adulterated Kratom product, and that there was no significant issue with respect to a Kratom-only death that was attributable to the toxicity of Kratom. We are not saying that it's impossible to overdose on Kratom. What we are looking at is the data that has been accumulated both from long-term chronic use of Kratom over in Southeast Asia, centuries of data, and looking here in the United States at the growing use of Kratom. And it is the considered opinion of the experts who have looked at this that there really isn't that significant an issue here that can be attributed solely to Kratom. There is always the question about whether Kratom could interact with a prescription drug that is currently on the marketplace. And of course, we're concerned about that, and we actually support efforts to examine that very issue. That is not unique to Kratom. It is for every dietary supplement that is approved for the marketplace, that they want to make sure that those interactions are identified. And when they are, the FDA takes the appropriate steps to have the prescribing physicians to look at the warning labels, and they amend their warning labels if they find a dietary supplement or some other substance that has an interaction with the approved drug that's in the marketplace, because that's the only effective way that they can actually warn physicians about drug interactions. But Kratom has not been subject to that. The Centers for Disease Control also issued a report that where they showed that there were 151 deaths, I think it was, where Kratom was detected in the tox screen of the decedent. And of those, just over 90 were implicated Kratom itself as a part of the autopsy, where there was a concern about it being a Kratom-associated death. But after they examined that data, their conclusion at the Centers for Disease Control was that there were actually only 7 deaths that may have been Kratom only, and of those, there was not really sufficient documentation available in the tox screen to make that determination. And even on those that they had available and tested the blood screen, they found that with more sophisticated testing technology, which many of the coroners and the medical examiners do not have available to them because of cost, they found that even those that were identified by coroners and medical examiners as kratom only, that they were actually, except for one, actually all kratom, they were all polydrug use or kratom contaminated products. And the only one that they couldn't examine was one where the blood wasn't available. So we can make these effective arguments, and the Board of Pharmacy didn't have the benefit of any of that. When I described this to the executive secretary of the Nevada Board of Pharmacy, he extended an invitation for us to engage in a discussion with the attorney so that we can start the process of informing the Board of Pharmacy the truth about kratom. Now, this work session did result in a decision by the Board of Pharmacy to move forward with the scheduling process. That process typically takes 2 years, unless there is some exigent circumstance, which is not present in this case, because there wasn't any outcry from the law enforcement people, or for that matter, the coroners, that there needed to be immediate action on this matter. And there was not an interest by any individual member of the Board of Pharmacy to take action immediately. And so this process typically takes that 2-year period. It will probably take a year or so for the staff to develop a recommendation that is fully researched and developed, and we will be a part of that process in providing information. I will benefit from the discussion that is scheduled for this coming week with the Board of Pharmacy attorneys and the staff there to establish a procedure where we can share information. We have made the offer from the American Kratom Association for Dr. Henningfield to participate in the discussion, as well as Jeff Laredo, the former National Institute on Drug Abuse consultant that now works with us on these issues. And we will be able, we believe, to make a very persuasive case as to why the Board of Pharmacy shouldn't go about this process. So that's the procedure that we're going to follow. I know that when this alert was published and it spread across the social media platforms, that there was a lot of concern, and legitimately so, because we don't want to see these kinds of things emerge and blossom into full-blown regulatory actions. The staff at the Board of Pharmacy actually knew about the fact that the legislature had passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. They view the action that was taken by the legislature, and I think they wrongly view it this way, as an attempt to start to protect consumers, and the next step would be, and it was their belief that the legislature wanted there to be a scheduling recommendation preceded, rather than a recognition by the legislature that the adulterated kratom products that were out in the marketplace needed to be controlled because the FDA refuses to, rather than saying this was just the first step of an initiative that the legislature supported. So we'll be able to discuss that, to inform them about it. I asked specifically if there was any member of the legislature who had weighed in on this process. The staff member had heard, had not directly talked with, that one of the members of the legislature on the House side had recommended that the Board of Pharmacy look at this issue. We think we know who that individual is. It's actually a physician. If it's the person that expressed concerns during the hearing and also argued on the floor of the House in the Nevada legislature that the Kratom Consumer Protection Act should not be passed, because she argued that the FDA, and repeated the FDA narrative, that it was a very dangerous substance. So we think that we're going to be able to address this issue effectively and plan to do so. The second part of this discussion really relates to the procedures that we use when we find these kinds of circumstances arise. And I wanted to discuss those so that people could be reassured about how this happens. We welcome the alerts by individual advocates when you hear about these kinds of initiatives. In this particular case, one of the subscription services that we have that looks at these regulatory actions had actually picked it up when the announcement was published by the Board of Pharmacy, even though it was at the last minute. And because of that, I was able to send an email requesting the opportunity to participate in a remote basis with the work session. Now, typically the meetings of the Board of Pharmacy in Nevada are available on the internet. This particular work session was not, because it wasn't any kind of formal action that was going to be taken. But the advantage of the email that I sent allowed for the staff to tell the members of the Board of Pharmacy that the American Kratom Association has an interest and would like to participate going forward. And so there was an acknowledgement by the board that they would welcome that. And so we'll take advantage of that invitation, and we'll continue to do so. But when it comes to other issues that are significant in the way that we handle these kinds of regulatory initiatives that begin, it is important for us to keep our heads about us. In the state of Ohio, when the Board of Pharmacy a year and a half ago initiated their effort to schedule Kratom, they opened up a public comment period. There were approximately 6,000 comments from Ohio Kratom consumers that were submitted. And we thought that was a very powerful argument. But when Jack Henningfield and I went to the meeting that was convened by the staff at the Board of Pharmacy in Ohio, we ran into a buzzsaw. There were 2 objections to the comments that had been submitted out of those 6,000 some odd comments. The first was a concern about an individual that had used inappropriate language in conveying their frustration with the proposed action by the Board of Pharmacy. The actual words that were used were not as bad as we often hear, but it was, I think, a staff of the Board of Pharmacy that was looking for an excuse in order to complain. The second was a specific threat that had been issued by an individual who apparently knew some of the staff members who sit on the Board of Pharmacy staff that support the Board of Pharmacy there in Ohio. And that threat was specific about the mother of one of the staff members and the fate that that mother, that this individual commenting thought should have. They were offended by that, and I think appropriately so, but not sufficient to overcome the fact that the facts should rule in these kinds of situations rather than emotions. And both Jack and I recommended that that individual and the Board of Pharmacy should refer that particular comment to the law enforcement officials to be appropriately investigated to determine whether or not it was a credible threat or not. Apparently nothing came of that, and so it obviously was just an expression of frustration, however inappropriate, by a Kratom advocate that took place. But it illustrates a potential problem, and that is that if we get too excited about some of these things, that we can be literally shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to being able to have a rational discussion. What happened in Ohio, we all know that when the Board of Pharmacy held its public hearing that was required by the statute, they had over 300 consumer advocates who showed up to testify. That was about 9 hours of testimony under the allocation of time that they gave to each individual. And it was mid-afternoon when still 3 hours left. They'd heard 6 hours of testimony that the Board of Pharmacy determined that they were going to wave the red flag and say that, or the white flag, I'm sorry, and say that they were withdrawing the recommendation and they were going to allow the legislature to actually proceed with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act consideration. However, and I believe that it was a somewhat coordinated effort, the Food Safety Division of the Department of Agriculture in Ohio then initiated an action whereby they said that any Kratom form of product that was either in a capsule or in a pill or a drink was banned from sale in the state of Ohio. And they initiated that action just at the beginning of the COVID virus in February, and they deferred any discussion about or objection that we clearly have with that policy going forward. In the interim, we have secured legal opinions from some of the leading law firms in the United States that deal in FDA law, and we have secured the services of a law firm in Columbus that specializes in the food, drug, and safety laws in the state of Ohio. And both of those legal entities have weighed in with legal opinions that contest the right of the Department of Agriculture to issue this kind of restriction on those dosage forms of Kratom. Their argument about allowing Kratom powders, as long as they are not labeled for human consumption, which means there can't be any indication about the safe amount of a Kratom serving size, or anything that we think typically should be associated with an informed consumer being able to look at a food ingredient, a dietary supplement, to make a good decision. So it's actually counterproductive. But from that, even though the Food Safety Division rejected our arguments, the director of the Department of Agriculture just last week has agreed to a call with us and with our attorneys, because in her characterization, there were some excellent points made in these legal opinions. Now, we think that that's going to come to a good conclusion. If not, of course, we'll pursue the legislative action there in Ohio. But I think it shows the power of both the advocacy community and a reasoned process by which we involve both the advocates from a lobbying standpoint and the attorneys. And that is the preferred way of doing it. There are always going to be occasions where we have to react quickly. We have to be loud, and we try to coordinate those efforts so that they are effective in delivering the message to the public officials or the elected officials about the right policy that ought to be implemented by Kratom. And we hope that we can build enough trust with the advocacy community that that's the appropriate way to do it. There are, within the Kratom community, a lot of advocacy groups that have popped up. And everybody is entitled to their view about how to proceed with these kinds of initiatives. We hope that in the future that we can coordinate those efforts so that an advocacy group doesn't just go out into the Ethernet and start to attack public officials because of rumors or because they decide that that's a good way for them to get more traction in gaining more supporters for their group. We get it. In the same way that the First Amendment guarantees the freedom of speech, we have the right of association under the Constitution, and so we respect the fact that there are other groups that are out there. But when it comes to misinformation, that's where we have to be able to discipline ourselves in order to have a message that is coherent. And that's what we strive to do here at the American Kratom Association. And so we hope that we've earned your trust. We hope that we will continue to have your trust as we move forward. We won't always agree, and we get that. And it doesn't mean that the American Kratom Association is perfect. We're not. But we do diligently analyze each step that we take, and at the time that we take it, we can document a very good rationale for doing so. We're going to continue to work aggressively in those states where we see these kinds of issues develop, as developed in Ohio, and that we're now facing in Nevada. And we promise to keep all of you informed as we go forward. So to that end, we commit to this kind of cooperation and dialogue. We will take steps in the future to protect the Zoom meetings, because the Zoom meeting we had to abort earlier today had been attacked by the pornography groups that have developed a methodology to penetrate that. There are security procedures that we will follow in the future that are more cumbersome, that allow access to our Zoom calls, but they will protect us, because those images were certainly awful that were there today. But it will not dissuade us at all from the efforts that we have to support the continued legal access of Kratom consumers to safe and unadulterated Kratom products. That is our mission, and we are committed to do so. And let me just end with this. In these very difficult times, we hope that everyone is staying safe, that your families are safe. We think that in the periods of isolation that go on in this kind of a pandemic, where there are many states that have stay-at-home orders, the isolation and the depression that is associated with that can have an impact. And in fact, we're seeing reports that the opioid overdoses have spiked during the coronavirus. And that's not surprising, given the kinds of issues that people who struggle with addictions confront. And now more than ever, Kratom needs to be accessible to those people that are struggling with those issues as a means of effectively helping to manage acute and chronic pain. So we're committed to that, continue to work on it, and we hope all of you and your families are safe going forward. I look forward to talking with you soon. We will convene another Zoom call this week after we've had the discussion with the Board of Pharmacy attorneys and staff to give you an updated report about what the next steps are. But we don't expect that there's going to be any emergency that we confront, that without there being a specific initiative by an individual member of the Board of Pharmacy to move this, which there does not appear to be, and despite, except for something that might emerge where there's a crisis that is attributed to Kratom in Nevada, which we don't expect, we're going to be able to work through this methodically and safely and carefully. And so to that end, I'll leave you with that note and look forward to talking with you soon. Thank you.